So hello, everybody. As I said, I'm Andrew Metrick and the director of the Yale Program on Financial Stability, and I am delighted to welcome everybody to a discussion of the first book in the Yale Program on Financial Stability series at the Yale University Press. And we could not have started with a better book. It is Tumultuous Times by Governor Masaki Shirakawa. And what we're going to do today is have a discussion about this book and get an opportunity for those of you who are listening, our friends from around the world, to ask questions. You'll note there is a Q&A button. I'm sure everybody has been using Zoom all year and has seen this before. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That's how we will take questions. And you should feel free to ask those questions throughout the hour that we have. So I have a set of questions that I have prepared for Governor Shirakawa, but he knows that I will interrupt my discussion and my questioning for questions that come from the group. If the questions that you have posted are related to the topic that we're currently discussing, then we'll slide it into the discussion as we go. But no matter what, we will leave some time at the end to take some of your questions. So that's plan number one. Plan number two is at the end of the seminar, we will share with you a link to where you can go and get a special seminar-only opportunity to buy the book from Yale University Press at a nice discount from a nice gift coming to us from our publisher. So once again, welcome. I want to say that I was struck in reading this book, and by how terrific it is, and how fantastic it is written in English. I would hate to have to try to write something in my second language. I couldn't write this well in English, much less my second language. Really well written. There's a lot of subtlety to the book and to the language that is used in the book. But I was struck by once again how lucky we were globally that the people who were in charge during the global financial crisis, almost by accident, were very experienced thinking about and dealing with financial crises. So Tim Geithner writes in his book about how he was created by financial crises in the 90s. We know Ben Bernanke, also in the United States, was a scholar of the Great Depression. And in Japan, we have the founder of the Financial Systems Department, the first person at the Bank of Japan to really be asked to think about these things from an organizational perspective and put together a group to think about these things. And as Governor Shirakawa points out in the book, he was an accidental governor. So we were just lucky. Globally, we were lucky, and that we had people who were forged by crisis to be thinking about things and acting in the midst of the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. So it's really terrific. I am not going to give you an introduction or a listing of his biography, which I assume everybody on this call already knows. And if you want more details, you should absolutely read the book. I'm instead going to jump right into questions. Okay, so the first question really comes from this part of your life where you were being forged. Where you were learning all of this, and you talk about in your discussion of the Japanese bubble period and crisis of the 1990s, you ask the question, did Japan kick the can down the road? So that's the title of a section in chapter 3 of the book. And you give several reasons that the principles that were laid out by the Financial System Department that worked on by you and your group, and that were largely agreed to at the Bank of Japan, and the Ministry of Finance knew about them, why those principles that were laid out in the early 90s were not necessarily executed in a timely manner as the crisis persisted through the decade. So what went wrong? And you conclude on page 66 writing, perversely, that Japan succeeded in averting acute financial panic, may have delayed public recognition of the seriousness of the problem, and also delayed the availability of public funds. And the context there was, well, we said do things fast, we said recapitalize the banks, but there was no panic. So there was not necessarily a political will to go and do all of those things. Okay, So now we have this big question, which I wonder, and I know you've wrestled with. If this is the case, given the challenge of trying to come up and get the fiscal authorities to give us the kind of funding necessary to actually fix these things before they become panics, are we doomed? Is it politically feasible to actually put into place the type of activity that was recommended and agreed to by the Financial System Department in the early 90s, that now, if you ask anyone, we would say, yeah, we should do this, we should fix things early? Is it ever going to be possible, or do we need some horrible scare? Do we need some Lehman moment before we can act?
Okay, thank you for your great question. Before I answer your question, first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this conversation with you. And also, I'm very honored that my book was published as a series of Yale program on financial stability. It's my great honor. Your question. The question you raise is exactly what I have been asking myself for the past 3 decades. And frankly, I still do not have an answer which I can confidently say to you. But I'm inclined to think that the answer is qualified yes. In 1990, so let me elaborate on that. In 1990s, when Japan was muddling through its own financial crisis, I was a bit more sanguine about the ability of central bankers and government officials to persuade politicians to adopt right policy measures than I am today. In 1992, the Bank of Japan proposed that we need the legal framework facilitating orderly resolution, and we need the public fund. And in doing so, Bank of Japan is prepared to provide capital, which is quite unusual for central bank. But those proposals was not accepted by the Ministry of Finance, partly or mainly because those ideas are not approved by the Parliament. And in those days, Japan was criticized as adopting so-called forbearance policy. And I still remember I was fiercely criticized in various international meetings as adopting forbearance policy. And I thought this is unique to Japan. But entering into 21st century, I have come to feel differently. In the United States, it took almost near collapse of financial system for TARP to be passed in the Congress in the autumn of 2008. And in the euro area, it took widespread fear of near collapse of euro for European stability mechanism to be instituted in the autumn of 2012. The difficulty stems from the simple fact that the use of taxpayers' money is so unpopular. The problem is globally common, and the difficulty, this difficulty is importantly rooted in the negative perception towards finance among ordinary citizens. We do not hear strong objection to the use of taxpayers' money in coping with suffering from natural disaster or pandemic. This difficulty is increasingly magnified by the growth of social media. Considering all this, as you pointed out, we tend to be hopeless about the role that technology experts such as central bankers or government officials could play. But if I dare to point out one positive factor. It should be our valuable experience of recent financial crisis itself. And unfortunately, before full-blown crisis erupted, the opposite to the use of taxpayers' money came from many people regarded as experts. In the case of Japan, government officials, not only government officials, but also academics and the CEO of financial institution were fiercely opposed. And the Bank of Japan was lonely. And I still remember very negative reactions of many economists and former policymakers in the US to the use of Section 13.3 of Federal Reserve Act in the event of JP Morgan's purchase of Bear Stearns. I hope experts now have drawn right lessons from recent financial crisis on which I would like to pin my hope. But I'm not sure whether we have learned right lessons. Judging from post-crisis reform of bank resolution, essentially the use of taxpayers' money is ruled out. And if the need should arise, we have to persuade, once again, Congress or Parliament, which may or may not succeed. So I have, on the one hand, I'm concerned with the president, but on the other hand, I am pinning my hope on the drawing lessons.
Thank you. Well, following up, continuing on this discussion, because we're really brings us right to some distinctions between the way Japan acted in the late 1990s and then the United States acted / didn't act in 2008. While you say, well, we weren't able to get everybody to agree, and it wasn't until the late 1990s that there was strong action taken, it did happen. The failure of the securities houses in late 1997, and you make very clear the positive lessons of the powerful response that may not have been absorbed by the rest of the world. So you talk about that in a few parts of the book, and your discussion specifically of the Lehman failure is careful and very fair to your friends here. I'm sure that if they read it, they would not disagree with what you said. But I think they would argue what the reasons were different. You seem surprised and maybe even a little disappointed that the U.S. response was not more forceful in September of 2008. And you write on page 150, it was a surreal moment for me to hear that a policymaker would let such a thing happen, but I knew that I had to move on because you had a job to do as well. Some of those friends who we know well, so Governor Shirakawa is a founding member of the advisory board at the Yale Program on Financial Stability and has been advising us and been tremendously helpful to us since the beginning. Also on our board is Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, since they all wrote about it in their memoirs, that they would say the main difference would be in authority. So you have the Authority to Act. You talk about how the old Bank of Japan Act gave the authority to the Bank of Japan. And I read it, and it basically says the Bank of Japan may do anything they want if they think they need to. The Section 13.3 is not, that's the old Bank of Japan Act. Section 13.3, the version that was in place in 2008, was not nearly as expansive.
Yeah.
So if one of your friends said, look, you had the authority and we didn't have the authority, what would you say?
Okay, as you explained, the Yamai Securities in 1997 was the Japanese equivalent to Lehman Brothers in 2008. So comparing central bank response to these two episodes provides a lot of food for thought. And first of all, as you mentioned, or as Paulson, Bernanke, and Geithner pointed out, the lack of legal authority was crucial. And this is very crucial. And in order to answer a question, I'd like to say a few things. First of all, I'm not saying which response is right, BOJ response or Fed response. And I offered two different arguments in my book. In terms of enabling injection of taxpayers' money, which was indispensable for an orderly handling of financial crisis. U.S. response might have been better or effective in that sense. In terms of avoiding unemployment, which could lead to the subsequent serious problem of the division of society, the Japanese society, the Japanese response might have been better. But in each case, merit and demerit are just two faces of the same coin. So we cannot pick up, we cannot cherry picking of good thing. Good thing is accompanied by bad thing. Assessing which response is better ultimately depends on the philosophy of each individual or each society. So there might not be universally acceptable, applicable answer. Having said that, I'd like to come back to your question. On a specific question of the lack of legal authority, yes, the old Bank Japan Law Act has a special clause which essentially says BOJ can do whatever it deems necessary to maintain financial stability if it gets approval from Minister of Finance. This clause might be regarded as almighty, but having said that, the bar for invoking this clause was high, given strong opposition of public money into large troubled banks at the time. And we are faced with heated discussion in those days. As the same with the US, the most crucial issue was whether or not a troubled bank, a troubled institution, Yamaichi in this case, was solvent. And put it differently, the issue was whether or not the Bank of Japan would suffer from loss. It was under such condition that BOJ decided to invoke this clause to enable the ordinary liquidation of Yamaichi. And ultimately, after the bankruptcy procedure was completed several years later, it turned out that Bank Japan suffered from losses. And as this implies, what the Bank of Japan and FRB were faced with was common, namely whether or not collateral was adequate. And when it comes to the value of collateral, it is well known that there's a significant gap between liquidation value and going value in the event of financial crisis. This distinction is crucially important. In this regard, how market participants perceive central bank's behavior as a lender of last resort is critically important. If central bank is perceived as very reluctant in liquidity provision, then collateral value of third banks will decline significantly because would-be franchise value will disappear. What I want to emphasize here is collateral value is a very dynamic concept depending on how central bank behave. So of course, so the question is the collateral value of Lehman is positive or negative in this dynamic sense. I do not know about collateral value of Lehman in this dynamic concept, but what would happen to the potential bidder of Lehman if US government had not adopted the strong rhetoric of non-bailout policy? And this is my lingering question. So I'm just posing this question. And also, as I said before, this depends on philosophy. And probably each society has a different the answer.
That's a very good point about the dynamic value of collateral. So, as you know, there was a debate even amongst the U.S. policymakers about
Yeah,
Hank Paulson's statement that
yeah,
there would be no there would be no bailout for
yeah,
Lehman. That
yeah,
Tim Geithner writes in his memoir about how
yeah,
he called him up over the weekend and said, "Why'd you say that?"
yeah, yeah. And the as you said, this sentence was most impressive for me.
Right, right. Um, okay, so I'm going to move on from the only very scary failure of a major financial institution to the extremely scary natural disaster tail risk world that we seem to be in, and that you experienced in your time as governor with the Great East Japan earthquake. Um, and you know, that we don't often think of it being a central banker's job to respond to a natural disaster, but pretty much every natural disaster or health disaster that we've seen in the last 25 years has required a vigorous central bank response. So it's quite clear that there needs to be a crisis response, a non-financial crisis response team within a central bank. Now, I was struck in reading this chapter by how many different things you had to worry about as governor, from the operational parts of the bank to the broader parts of the financial system, to simply making sure that people were confident in the stability of everything that was going on. And you in reflecting on that, you conclude in chapter 13 on page 271, given the nebulous nature of tail events in macroeconomic policy, it is the central bank, which by its nature is attentive to tail risks, that has the responsibility to think clearly about such risks and explain them to the public. Okay, now I looked around in that chapter to see if this was written after COVID, but it was not. So you wrote this and thought through all these things, you know, before COVID swept the world, and of course since then the pressure on central banks to be broader, not just with regards to the pandemic response, which it was, but it's even, it seems to be accelerated, that central banks should be combating climate change. And so I wonder what you think about those sort of broader issues, things that it's become clear are in some sense inside the mandate of a central bank because they're tail risks. On the other hand, they're pretty far removed from monetary policy. So what should the stance be, and how active should the Bank of Japan and the ECB and the Fed be in tackling these issues?
Okay, first of all, the the our experience of Great East earthquake of Japan was really, really terrific. And Tokyo is 106 kilometers away from nuclear power plant at Fukushima. But every day, the all kind of rumors are coming in terms of radiation. And if radiation, serious amount of radiation come to Tokyo, still we have to maintain the functioning of a central bank. And we discuss how to maintain the functioning of payment system, etc. So these are really tests by which central bank is tested. And as you said, how to cope with tail risk is one of important function of central bank. But there are many tail risks. So if central bank really try to cope with all kind of tail risk, then central bank mandate is increasing a lot. And your question is framed in terms of how wide central bank mandate should be. And nowadays, the pressure on central bank to expand their mandate is increasing. A case in point is a recent central bank response to climate change. And of course, the if climate change risk coming from climate change really materialized, the loss is really huge and tail event in true sense. And but I suspect, and in this case, the issue is whether or not central bank is engaged with climate change issue by outside pressure. And I sometimes wonder whether central banks themselves are perceiving this as pressure from outside. Rather, I suspect they themselves feel obliged to do something by their own initiative. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but I interpret the current phenomena in the following manner. First, the independent central bank can take action quickly without securing the approval of government or parliament, unlike fiscal policy. Second, central bank's action have some impact on climate change through financial channel, even though this channel is not so great. And those actions can be justified on the ground that climate change affects price stability or macroeconomic stability. And third and most importantly, central banks want to be seen as institutions which serve society by playing a part in the most important challenge for human beings in decades to come. Such perception is critically important because central bank independence is ultimately supported by societal sympathy with central bank. And these kind of dynamics or psychology are working. And I do not deny the importance of climate change in terms of tail risk. And I fully understand a good intention and logic behind recent decisions on climate change by central bank. But at the same time, it is somewhat slippery, I would say. Everything, including climate change, affects price stability or macroeconomic stability. But once we adopt this kind of logic, I'm afraid that central banks might go too far. For instance, how about other element of ESG or SDGs? Then it may end up with entering into sphere of fiscal or political nature. If that is the case, eventually we might risk losing the perception that central bank is a neutral institution, which might lead to the loss of central bank independence. For this reason, I'm a bit cautious about, so to speak, the recent expansionism of central bank. But on the other hand, I'm deeply concerned with the recent opposite trend of interpreting central bank mandate, that is focusing on price stability. Looking back the long history of central bank, this is rather new interpretation, well, this is a narrow interpretation of central bank mandate. I think the most basic mandate of central bank is to foster the sustainable monetary, the foster sustainable monetary and financial environment most conducive to sustainable economic growth. Price stability and financial stability is just two faces of the same coin of currency stability. In that sense, I disagree with the dichotomy that monetary stability is assigned to price stability and supervision and regulation or the macroprudential policies are assigned to financial stability. We have to be alert to the accumulation of financial imbalances, even though inflation rate is below target. In terms of sustainability, in terms of tail event, central bank have to start with the field which they have relative advantage. First, price stability, financial stability, and eventually they have to cope with climate change might be a candidate, but before jumping into that area, we should pay more attention to financial stability. And that is my honest reaction.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on that with a question from the audience, from our participants, and here, with climate change, the struggle, as you describe it, and I would agree with this, is to what extent is this inside our mandate? To what extent does this have to do with financial stability? But one couldn't make an argument that it does. Okay. Then there's another topic, and this is certainly a big topic in the United States now, and I'm not sure what the experience is right now in Japan, but that topic for central banks in this is on inequality. So Bill English, who's a professor at the Yale School of Management with me, and as you know, was director for many years of the Monetary Affairs division at the Federal Reserve. He's wondering about this, and he asks, what does Governor Shirakawa think central banks should do regarding distribution? Should central bank policy try to address income distribution or the economic situation of minorities? If so, what can central banks do to address these issues? Now, what makes this interesting is it's clearly not financial stability, but it is also the case. We know that central bank policy is not neutral with regard to this, with regards to distribution. It has some effects. So should we be thinking about it? And to what role should it come in? So I know Bill's trying to figure out the answer to this question. He's hoping that you will give him this answer so that he doesn't have to think about it anymore and he can just use your answer in his class.
Okay. The issue of inequality is very profound. And my answer is this. After the collapse of Lehman, many central banks, including Federal Reserve and Bank of Japan, acted aggressively as a lender of last resort. And this was most important in preventing full-blown crisis from materializing. And this has also implication for unemployment. If that kind of bold action would have not been available, then the unemployment would have been much more serious, which produced much more serious the distribution issue. So in that sense, central bank has a lot of play to prevent inequality. But if the Bill's question is about the role of monetary policy on the inequality issue in more normal time, then I don't buy into the argument that monetary policy should be geared toward income equality issue. And one more thing, and as you might have noticed, I'm very skeptical about the effect of prolonged monetary easing. And after, beyond certain point, the effectiveness of monetary easing is very limited. But nonetheless, the effect on financial asset prices is very visible, very evident, and it increased the asset prices, which is mainly held by the wealthy people, and the prompt monetary easing. On the one hand, prompt monetary easing is not that effective in stimulating economic activity. On the other hand, it could worsen the wealth distribution. So in that sense, it might have some bearings on equity issue. But other than that, I'm against the idea that monetary policy should be geared toward equity distribution issue.
Thank you. A theme of the answer to both of the last two questions is, in your answers, is that the central bank needs to pay attention to these things in some sense because it has to maintain its credibility with the public, and it needs that. It needs to not get too far away from what it is that the public wants, for practical reasons, in part because it would lose its independence if it did. The government would rein it in as it should. So you write, the last piece of your term as governor was taken up by the joint statement that eventually came out, the joint statement between the Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance, echoing the most recent joint statement before that was important, was in the 1950s in the United States. So this is somewhat novel territory. You write on page 359 when discussing this, central banks were fixated on delivering something that would satisfy calls for them to behave in an accountable manner. They were, in fact, under collective pressure from society at large. It seemed to me that in response to this pressure, there was a tendency for these banks to adopt policies that aimed to generate short-term benefits without consideration of the longer-term consequences, which I labeled as being a problem of, quote, social dominance. I really like that term. I think it's very, we talk a lot about fiscal dominance, but fiscal dominance is a raw political power kind of a thing, whereas social dominance is things we do to maintain that independence. So you've coined a new term in English. Sounds pretty good in English. Maybe it's even better in Japanese. And I wonder if it's even more important than fiscal dominance. So here now for the joint statement, it seemed like in reading the chapter, you were really doing everything possible to keep the independence so that you weren't going to bind the hands of your successors, but even under the extreme political pressure with the government at that time that really had a different stance on monetary policy. The very existence of this pressure makes me wonder whether or not independence, the way we hope it would exist, can ever really be there. You dedicate all of chapter 22, and I encourage people to read that, so I'm not going to ask you to summarize the whole chapter, but instead talk a little about how you felt personally during the drafting of this joint statement. Did you feel independent, or did you feel under a lot of pressure? Would there have been any feasible way for the parties to tie their hands such that there really would be a feeling of independence among your successors?
Okay, as is the same with the first question. I've been asking this question for many years. And looking back, when I was young, I was more naive. And in those days, central bank is important, and politicians are just looking at short-term gain. Therefore, central bank is needed. And in doing this kind of discussion, oftentimes the politicians are bad guys, and central bankers are good guys. But this kind of simplest view is not appropriate. And when I talk with politicians privately, they fully understand what central bank is saying. But at the same time, they're constrained by election. So eventually, those behavior of politicians are dictated by what voters are saying explicitly or implicitly. And so in that sense, just blaming fiscal dominance or the aggression by politicians is not right. In that sense, I use the term the social dominance. And I believe central bank independence is important, but we have to be clear about from whom central bank should be independent. If central bank is allowed to do whatever they think is right, it becomes a kingdom within a country. It is very dangerous in a democratic society. I dislike that kind of idea. What is expected of central bank independence is independence from social tendencies to pursue short-run gain, which could threaten long-run sustainability of the economy and, for that matter, society. Central bank independence ultimately depends on support of people who recognize the weakness of human being and just think having such institution is important. And what government was saying when Bank of Japan discussed the joint statement with them in 2013, which you mentioned, could be summarized by 3 propositions. Number 1, the root cause of low growth of Japanese economy was deflation. Number 2, deflation is monetary phenomenon. A massive expansion of central bank balance sheet could easily solve deflation. Number 3, so the Bank of Japan should achieve 2% inflation target within 2 years by adopting inflation targeting framework. These are arguments by the government. I could not agree with those arguments totally. But it was true that ruling party, which especially argued this, won the election by overwhelming margin. On top of that, economists, including famous foreign academics, basically supported these arguments. And media and corporate CEO also supported those arguments. Given this, in a democratic society, Bank of Japan cannot say, no, you are totally wrong. To say so means that central bank is a kingdom within a country. But at the same time, I thought if Bank of Japan succumbed to this kind of argument and adopted such policy, it would be very detrimental to the economy later. So I try to include various clauses in the joint statement in order to prevent the pursuit of the aggressive monetary easing in a mechanical manner, hoping that eventually rationality would return and people would come to realize aggressive monetary easing is not a solution. Now, many people know the consequence of Japanese great monetary experiment. It took so many years to learn 3 propositions were wrong. It is sad or tragedy, but I now feel this may have been a price for democracy. And so coming back to your question, central bank independence does not exist without reasonable amount of support of people. But this does not mean central bank is hopeless. Central banks have to make the best effort at earning such support without compromising the fundamental mission of central bank. Of course, it is easier said than done, but that is my thought today.
Thank you. I have a follow-up to this that comes from one of our participants, and it relates to this topic really quite closely. And one of our other friends, Paul Tucker, who is also on our board of advisors, and I know you know well. And Paul wrote a very interesting book, really about just this topic, central bank independence and whether or not unelected power is
Yeah.
the name of it, and whether or not they should be, to what extent they shouldn't be a kingdom. But specifically, and here the question is from Caleb Nygaard. Caleb asks, what's the appropriate political activity for a central banker? So Paul Tucker says, I don't even vote. So, Paul says, I don't even go to the polls and vote. That's how politically neutral I am. And what do you think? I mean, to what extent should the central banker be viewed? Because if you're viewed too far away from it, well, then you're a kingdom. If in other words, you want to be totally independent of politics, then you're just saying you don't care what the people think. On the other hand, if you're viewed as a creature of politics, it's very difficult to have credibility that you're going to do monetary policy for monetary policy's sake and not for another reason. So I'm not going to ask you if you vote or who you voted for, but just wonder what do you think is proper?
First of all, this is really conundrum, and central bank has been evolving historically, and each central banks is reflecting its own history and society. So there's no universal answer. But at the end of the day, what is crucial is who is running central bank. And in this regard, the appointment of the central bank governor is very crucial. And also appointment of board members are very crucial. And also staffings are very crucial. Central bank is an institution, and the institution is consisting of governor, board members, and staff. And on top of that, institutional culture created by all these three groups are important. And it is critically important that central bank is perceived as an institution which is very faithful to the very mission of central bank, and that is currency stability. And this is not created overnight, and this is created gradually, and so long history. So if the question is how to invent the idea of central bank, that is not question to be asked. And so over time, the persons constituting central bank have to make that kind of effort. And at the same time, and this is a chicken and egg problem. And if society really needs good central bank, then the appointment should follow that kind of desire on the part of general public. So I fully recognize that I'm doing chicken and argument, but that kind of effort is needed.
Thank you. We have a lot of really terrific questions that have come from participants. So I want to apologize in advance that I'm not going to get to all of them. So for those of you who posted questions, we will share all of these questions with Governor Shirakawa, so he will see what it is that people are interested in. But we won't be able to get to all of them today. But let's see how many we can do. A question from Dick Berner. So Dick ran the Office of Financial Research. He was the first director of the Office of Financial Research in the United States, and he's now teaching at NYU this stuff. And he asks, I think, a perennial question here. So do there need any changes needed to financial stability policy and regulation to reduce the expectation that central banks will always respond to shocks by backstopping the financial system? So you've alluded to this issue, but it'd be good to have your thoughts specifically on these remedies. So if we think the central bank is going to rescue everybody, is this bad? And what do we need to do to create something that's less bad?
Essentially, what the central bankers and regulators have been doing after the global financial crisis is right. And first, they implemented measures to enhance the, the resiliency of individual banks by asking more capital and more liquidity. And also the, the macro various measures of macro-prudent policy are introduced. And also we have made a great effort at resolving the bank resolution in a global setting. All these are important, but just to focus on micro supervision or macro prudence, prudential policy is not enough. And also we have to be attentive to the implication of prolonged monetary easing. And at the end of the day, the financial crisis is produced by various kinds of financial imbalances, such as the rise in asset price, the increase in indebtedness, or increased maturity mismatch, or increased currency mismatch, or concentration of the risk into a narrow set of the economic entity. And all these phenomena are not solved by supervision or macroprudential policy as such alone. And eventually, it is monetary policy which determines the amount of debt at society level, or it might produce the skewness of a position. So we have to strike the balance between the effort at the regulation front and the effort at monetary policy. That is what is somewhat lacking today.
Thank you. So I have another really good question that comes from participants, but it's a question that you might want to duck a little bit. So I'm having it right at the end, just in case you want to give a very short answer and run out the clock. So hang on here. So this question comes from Adam Keeney, and Adam asks, how does Governor Shirakawa view the growth in the BOJ's balance sheet since his term ended in 2013? In 2013, the balance sheet size was in line with the ECB Fed, but since then has grown to globally unprecedented levels relative to GDP. See, so you just got a couple minutes left to explain what you think about the balance sheet and comment on what has happened since you left.
Okay, the growth of the Bank of Japan balance sheet was extraordinary. And when I left the Bank of Japan, I expected, of course, the balance sheet would increase rapidly, but even so, the expansion was more than I expected, or more than many expected. And again, as I expected, this didn't increase inflation rate. But I'm not saying that this is not problem as such. And the problem is not about deflation. The basic problem, the fundamental problem facing Japanese economy is the declining population and declining gross productivity. And so in that sense, I'm not blaming the failure of raising inflation rate. But the problem is people saw that this expansion of central bank balance sheet could solve the problem. And but as I said, this didn't produce such good hope result. So in that sense, it was a sort of we wasted time, and so the energy we should put consume. So in that sense, this was a problem, and people often ask about exit policy, but we have to distinguish between the problem, technical problem with exit policy and the fundamental problem with exit policy. In technical sense, this is not that difficult. Just to raise interest on reserve is needed. But the problem is, if we do that, then for instance, the government deficit problem, government finance problem would become more serious. So in that sense, exit policy is how to reform, how to implement fiscal reform. This is the root cause problem, how to implement economic and fiscal reform. So that is my reaction towards central bank, Bank of Japan balance sheet expansion.
Thank you. That was terrific. You managed to do that in 3 minutes. Very impressive. We've come to the end of our time. We have enough questions to go for another hour at least. So we'll send them along to you so you can see what people are asking. And we will also send a link so that people can buy this wonderful book, which I learned a lot reading it, Governor Shirakawa. So thank you once again for allowing this to be the first book in our series. And I hope everybody has a good day. Any final words?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the discussion with you, and your question makes me feel about writing another book.
Oh boy. Well, we'll publish that one too. We'd be delighted to. So thank you very much. Thank everybody and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.